Hello, I'm Arne de Kaiser, who, along with my colleague and fellow interviewer Neil Horner, represent the Weston Voices Oral History Project, an initiative sponsored by the Weston Historical Society. Bob, thank you and your wife Hope for inviting us into your house today. Tell us, when did you move to Weston, and what made you decide to settle here? And what was the town like in those days?
We moved to Weston because I got a job at Sikorsky Aircraft in Stratford and at Bridgeport at that time. And in looking around, we just happened to find a house in this town, which we liked. So we moved here in June of '53 and lived on Weston Road. It was a house that was just completed.
You mentioned that you, when you came here, you were working for Sikorsky.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how you were educated and what was your profession and how did you end up working for Sikorsky and what did you do?
I went to Hackley, Cornell, and then I started out in Bristol Myers Engineering Department. And then I went to Sikorsky just because the job was offered. It was there, and I liked the idea of getting out of New York City. I had a job there that was not satisfactory to me. And so I was at Sikorsky for 35 years. And another difference is when I commuted to Sikorsky in the 50s, there was no traffic. It was very easy. There was no parking problem. And when I retired in '86, the Merritt Parkway was becoming a sort of a moving traffic jam.
When you moved into Weston, who were your neighbors? Not specifically by name, but what kind of people were they?
Mostly they were locals. When we moved in, there were still a good body of local people here. They were not necessarily farmers. A lot of them worked for the town, were local tradesmen, people like that. While we were here is when the influx came of all the new marrieds, and they comprised most of our acquaintanceship during those years. They came in droves, and they are the ones who populated all these houses that were being built on the new roads that were being built in town, like Joanne Lane and Cardinal Lane and Greenlee and Ravenwood, Mountain View. All of those were new roads. And as the houses went up, the people appeared, and they were the ones who had children that went to school, and that's what caused the great burgeoning of population in the school system. And it was they were a very vibrant new element in the town, and they are the ones who largely displaced the good old boy type of government that the town had when we moved in. When we moved in, it was very sleepy, complacent, and the one town official would hire another town official to, I don't know, plow the streets or something like that. It was casual. It wasn't necessarily corrupt, but it was very local. And again, it was sort of the good old boy system. And it had worked for years. But with the advent of the influx of new population, these people were much too critical and live wire and onto things to allow that to continue. And
When
that's
was
when
this?
things began to change.
And this was in the 50s, late
This
50s,
was-
early 60s?
Late 50s, early 60s. Because we changed from an appointed boards to elected boards in the election of '67. And that's when I ran for P&Z. Because I didn't think I would have a chance before then, because for some reason the power structure in the town didn't feel they could count on me to have a known viewpoint. So that was sort of a little dangerous to them. But I ran for office on P&Z and I got elected. And so that would really change everything in the town when all the boards went to elected. We got a different mix.
How controversial was your position at the time? Did you feel like you were bucking a tide that was going in a different way?
I think the balance of the town supported me. Yes, I think that's why I was reelected. I was a popular candidate because I came close to leading the ticket in the elections, and that was a reflection, I think, of the position that I had about let's say, the status quo. And for many people, the status quo is anathema. If you don't change things, well, you're not progressing. You're not with it. And it was somewhat the same way with the town. The character of the town began to change, though, with around the 80s. And there it began to change in the architecture and the way wealth discovered the town and began to build these very large houses. This was a very big house when we moved here in 57. Now, a big house is a big house. So any number of larger mansions, I won't call them mansions, they were just very, very big houses with all kinds of amenities, media rooms, indoor pools, so forth. That became the theme for new houses in town. And one reason being that if you had the money to buy the land, well, you had the money to build a big house.
And what was the focus of P&Z when you were elected? Were there some major issues that needed to be dealt with right away, or things were pretty well under control?
The major issue was maintaining 2-acre zoning, because the town wasn't nearly as densely packed as it is today. Today, it's almost an academic question because there's so few acres available anywhere. In those days, there was lots and lots of open land still remaining, and there were commercial and other forces that would love to have, and the people who owned the property would have loved to have been able to get away with, say, 1 acre and increase the value of their land. So there was very strong attitude of the people who had moved into town to maintain the 2-acre zoning, including the newcomers, because they said, we've got that part of the character of the town is the 2-acre zoning, because that gives us the separation and the idea that we're not going to have somebody in our looking in our window from next door. I think that and the school population, the financing of that. The budgets, again, like today, the budgets were always contentious because they were always too high. They were unconscionably high, and taxes were always too high. They should be cut back. And yet, we still had the realities of life we had to deal with.
What commercial enterprises were still in town when that was taking place?
A wire mill was running. That was a going operation. The center had just come into being because Peter Robinson built it in the dark of night, so to speak, because there was no zoning. And he put up the center, and the town was aghast, or the old timers were aghast. So the town instituted a lawsuit against him. They hastily passed zoning regs. The first ones were 1 acre. And they passed that. Then they took Peter to court. And fortunately, Peter won the case so that the center could stay there. Because the fact that the center is there was the most wonderful relief valve from further commercial development in the town that you can imagine. It was a godsend. We didn't know it at the time. We looked at it as a horror, but actually it was a godsend. Because if that center hadn't been there, we would have gotten, well, North Main, or the Midtown Garage that is up the road, that would have probably expanded with a little store here and a little store there. Weston Gardens down at the corner would have expanded. We would have had a strip zone of commercial, in my opinion, all the way up to Georgetown if that center had not been there first. And that brought a focus to everybody's attention. Never again, no more commercial in town.
Now, this was in 1952 when the center
That
opened,
was,
right?
yes.
Now you joined the Young Republicans, I understand, and how was the politics in the late 50s and 60s?
When we moved here in town, it was a Republican town. There was an established Republican group. They were largely the old timers in town. Some were like Willard Fanton. Okay, Fanton's had been in town for, I don't know, 100 years or so. He was the first selectman, I believe, at the time. And the others that were in there, Herbie Gifford, and so on, that came along to serve as second selectman, because the second selectman usually took care of the roads. That was sort of given. And he, in turn, got his guys together to take care of the roads. So again, it was the spreading out of the duties of government through a rather, you could call it a patronage system, but it wasn't all that evil. And it seemed to work pretty well when we were a sleepy little town. But then when we began to get all this activity and new homes coming in and lots of need for school buses and all the rest, it took on a different character. And the the old timers began to be displaced. They didn't like it and they fought it, but the force was too great. The young Republicans were, in effect, the junior members of the Republican Party who had just moved in. All the people like myself who have moved in were having families and so on, and we were full of energy and ideas. So we formed this group that held monthly meetings and had agendas. It was very active. We became a political force gradually. We were viewed with suspicion because normally the president of Young GOP would become a member of the town committee, a Republican town committee, when he resigned, and anybody from the Republican town committee left, he would take the place. Well, I was president of the YGOP for 2 years, and I was never invited to be on the Republican town committee. Again, if you're outspoken, why, it's not necessarily a favorable attribute among some political forces. They prefer to have something more predictable. So I think that slowed me down a little. But the 67 change of the charter so that people were elected rather than appointed was the window I needed to get into the mainstream.
You were outspoken politically as well as outspoken in terms of the development of the town?
Well, Hope's listening to this. I guess on all subjects. Well, I just have my own views.
In your decades here, you must have also met some real local characters, not only the celebrities and the famous people.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear some of the most unforgettable characters that you've met over the years.
I remember John Bross, the building inspector. He had his own firm ideas about buildings and what were necessary and so forth. And he kind of felt that, well, if I don't think it's necessary, you don't have to do it. He was an independent thinker when it came to the building code. Well, I knew a bunch of the people who took care of the roads in town. I remember two characters tended to rent their equipment to the town at a rather high price. And it was interesting. The Democrat on the Board of Selectmen was almost always from Georgetown. And it was a token assignment. And the Democrats would find somebody there who would serve. Dick Voigt began to look at the books. And he noticed that one of these people was renting a chainsaw to the town at $100 a day. And the other one was renting his digger to the town, even though it was parked. It was an old digger, all rusty. And it was parked in a corner, wherever he could park the darn thing. And that was being rented to the town. Well, Dick wrote this story, and, I'll divert myself. Pat Heifetz started the Weston Forum. And she did it by dint of her own energy and the fact that she felt this town needed a paper. And it's almost like Pat Gay today. She was it, and she did most of the articles. She was at the the meetings all the time. She was a gadfly. And that wasn't bad because, she made a cartoon of me one time. I was sitting there on my throne with a crown on my head because I made some decision she thought was exceedingly autocratic and uncalled for, meaning she disagreed with it. But Dick Boyd released the findings he had to the forum, and that is when it hit the fan. And all of a sudden, the two gentlemen involved retired to Florida. And at that point, the selectmen said, "What are we going to do? How are we going to run the road system in town?" So they appointed me and four other guys to a highway study commission. Well, I wasn't the chairman. They made me chairman, mainly because I was the guy who was willing to put in the time. So I chaired that, and we came up with a highway study report, which I have a copy of, and I think the library has copies of it, which was quite simple, and it just recommended that the town come up with a minimal highway department. Don't staff for everything, such as sweeping the roads and trimming the trees and so on. Do it for the normal summer construction, clearing out the catch basins and so on, and plowing snow in the winter, and subcontract for all the peripheral duties where it required special equipment or special skills. Tree trimming is a specialty, and so on. So that's the way it went through. We set it up. The town adopted that pretty much as the framework of our system. Well, typically, the way all bureaucracies work, the highway department began to branch out and reach into other areas and take on equipment. And you take on the equipment, you take on the personnel. And so now it's a pretty big operation. It's a good operation. I think Joe Lametta runs a good shop there. But that's what happened there to take over from the very rural good old boy type of town functioning. I retired when I was 65, which was 1986.
And you're how old now?
94.
That's a lot of contributions you made to the town over these years. I wanted to follow up something, talk about some of those controversies that you were involved in.
Well, I would say it more that I was outspoken. Because I don't feel that my positions were controversial. I thought they were pretty darn reasonable, and I still do. Because if they're not reasonable, I'm not going to hold for them. So I was not in the mainstream often, because very often the mainstream is really the old stream, just plowing ahead and not seeing where it's going. I would guess I'm a born conservative in that I feel that you've got to pay for everything. And that is not only money, but it's duty, it's care, it's all those things. And stemming from that, when I look at, I guess probably the reason I stayed a Republican most of my life is because my Democratic friends would never tell me how you're going to pay for it. And I thought that was kind of a central to the question. Now, Paul Krugman of the New York Times wouldn't worry about that. But it bothered me. And in that sense, I'm a conservative. And I think Hope is a born conservative. She's sort of, Griggs is Scottish and so on. And so she minds a penny, and she's very sensible. And so I think some of that sensibility also rubbed off on me, that there should be a sensibility to everything you do. So much of politics is pretense or fake argument. And so maybe I didn't go along with it. I think the controversial aspect of it is a consequence, not because I was controversial to start with. I think I was just taking a position that I thought was rational, and somebody else thought I was controversial because I was upsetting the apple cart.
The town is again talking about development and planning. Tell us a little bit about your role in developing the first town plan.
It came about, I think, because of a statutory requirement. So we did it. And the big question was, some people felt the town was completely inequitable in offering services to the world at large, that we should have public housing, that we should have all kinds of things, and that we should have, people shouldn't have to drive so far to get a loaf of bread. There was much feeling like that. And all of this reflected back in how the town was going to present in its town plan arguments that might reject the idea that we want to revise our regulations for that. So we had to be careful in our wording. We had to present a good case, and we did. And it was a rational case. It was based upon the logic of the way the town is set up. That has been pretty much followed and reiterated in each of the successive town plans. The way I see the one today, I just say this is the same record going around again. There are people who say, "Oh, we need this," "Oh, we've got to bring in that," and I say, unless conditions have changed, go ahead, look into it. And I think your reasoning, as you find out the facts, will lead you to the conclusion that it doesn't make much sense. So it doesn't bother me too much that these ideas are presented. As a matter of fact, I think they should be reviewed with each iteration of the town plan to make sure that we are staying current with current social needs of a Connecticut small town. But I think we should also keep in mind that these people aren't inventing anything. They're not having any ideas that the people didn't have back in the 50s. If you follow the facts, you'll probably come up with an iteration of the town plan that will be remarkably similar to the ones we've put out in the past. I wouldn't expect big changes, but those people are going to have to follow through on it and see where it leads them. The forum has this concern about the town of Weston isn't growing. I don't know of any reason why it should grow. I don't know what the imperative is. Is there some imperative that says Weston should be 20,000 people in 10 years and 30,000 in another? What is the force behind it? It doesn't make sense. Unless you want to completely change Weston and bring in a new type of town. So that, again, I think that will take care of itself. Sure, Weston's slow on sales. It's an expensive town, and it takes a lot of money.
What would people say about you?
Well, I think, one, I'm an optimist. I think I was given very good background training by my mother, which was a staunch Christian lady, very quiet about it, but very Christian, and my father. I was adopted, and so both my parents are adopted parents, but they were my parents, and they were both staunch Christian people. They gave me very strong moral background to compare against, so that I always knew if I was shading the question. I think also that the people I knew were very much the same way. The woman who adopted me was a Vassar graduate in 1918 who went out to Wyoming because she loved horses and wanted adventure. She went down to the orphanage in Laramie for a while, and it was while she was there, because of the crowding, I, as one of five, family of five. I had one brother who died, three sisters who went with me to the orphanage. I was one who got moved into the room with her. And you know how bonding takes place between people. you get a small child, you cannot just break that bond. So when it came time for Mom to come back to the East to get married and lead the normal Eastern establishment life, she said, I'm not coming back without this little boy. And she wouldn't come back. So she finally managed with the Bishop of Wyoming to make arrangements for her to adopt me as a single woman.
You attended Cornell.
I left Cornell, enlisted. I expected to go either to Camp Fort Bragg in Alabama or Georgia, wherever it is, or Fort Sill in Oklahoma, because those were the training grounds for the armored divisions. I got on a troop train out of Camp Upton in Long Island. We ended up in Biloxi, Mississippi, at Keesler Air Force Base, and it had just been a filled-in swamp. And that's when I first found out that I was in the Army Air Corps. And so I went to radio gunnery school. My eyes weren't good enough, so I couldn't fly. So I went into a radio operator gunner school in Sioux Falls in the winter, freezing cold. It's like Minnesota. And I came in about second of a class 800. So they meant I was noticed. So they sent me to communications school. And I scored there well, so I was noticed. So they sent me to radar school because radar was the big thing then. So I ended up in a radar development unit that was trying to figure out how you can use radar in bombing missions. So I ended up at Langley Field flying in a B-17 that was radar equipped, and we always got the latest. It was very interesting information, and I think that's why I ended up there, just because I was able to keep up with the technology and so forth, and I was probably in a good spot. I probably did as much as a member of the armed forces as I could have there. I don't know whether I don't think it made a good infantryman at all. I was too scared.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. So
Well,
thank you.
I've enjoyed it. I'm glad you guys came. And I'm glad the words will get carried on. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot about this town. And I think there's another generation that will enjoy reading all this stuff. And drawings benefit from it.